Something is wrong with the way we think about gut health. We spend hundreds of dollars a year on probiotic capsules and fiber supplements, all designed to fix a problem that people in ancient times simply did not have. And most people assume they know why. They assume ancient people were just tougher, built differently. That is not what happened. The bread Jesus broke with his disciples was sourdough, slow fermented, alive. The health and resilience of those civilizations was not accidental. It came from something every ancient kitchen had, and that modern food manufacturing now works very hard to prevent. Not a herb, not a remedy, just food that had been allowed to ferment. And what happened during that process is something the entire billion-dollar supplement industry is still trying to replicate in a capsule. It cannot. Today we are counting down 15 fermented foods from ancient tradition that modern science is still catching up to. Long before anyone understood what a bacterium was, people across the ancient world had figured something out. Salt and cabbage, left alone together in a sealed container, became something different, something that lasted, something that kept people alive through winters, sea voyages, and seasons of scarcity when nothing fresh was available. The Book of Numbers records the Israelites carrying preserved salted food across the desert during their wilderness wandering. Salt-preserved fermented vegetation was not a culinary preference. It was survival technology, practiced independently across virtually every civilization that ever faced a winter or a long journey. Chinese laborers building the Great Wall were fermenting cabbage and rice wine over 2,000 years ago. Roman soldiers carried it on military campaigns. And centuries before anyone thought to pack citrus on ocean voyages, German sailors were preventing scurvy at sea with barrels of fermented cabbage. Captain James Cook documented this in his own journals, crediting it with keeping his entire crew alive through months of open water, sailing with no access to fresh food. What those cultures preserved without understanding the mechanism, modern science can now describe precisely. Raw, unpasteurized sauerkraut contains lactobacillus cultures in counts reaching billions per serving. Enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy on a months-long ocean crossing. Vitamin K2, glucosinolates with documented activity in cancer research, and organic acids that studies suggest directly reduce inflammation in the gut lining. A landmark Stanford University study found that fermented foods increased microbiome diversity more effectively than even a high-fiber diet, a result that surprised the researchers themselves. The detail that determines whether sauerkraut does anything for you. The shelf-stable jar in the grocery aisle has been pasteurized. That heat kills every live culture it ever contained. What you want lives in the refrigerated section or in your own mason jar. Pack shredded cabbage with 1 to 2 teaspoons of non-iodized salt per pound. Press until the brine rises above the vegetable, cover loosely, and leave at room temperature for 5 to 7 days. When it smells sour and bubbles when opened, it is alive. 2 to 4 tablespoons with meals. Never discard the brine. It is as therapeutically active as the cabbage itself. The sailors had no concept of lactobacillus. They had generations of evidence that the men who ate it came home. Modern research is now explaining why. And by the time we reach number 8, you will see that same pattern. Ancient practice confirmed by modern science, in a way that stops being interesting and starts being extraordinary. Proverbs chapter 27. To the hungry soul, every bitter thing is sweet. Traditional Korean culinary wisdom understood that in a very specific way. Kimchi was never designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be functional. There is a significant difference. Fermented cabbage and radish with chili, garlic, ginger, and traditionally fish sauce, kimchi stretches back over 2,000 years in Korean tradition. Households maintain dozens of varieties simultaneously in clay pots called ongi buried in the ground to maintain stable temperature. The diversity of varieties was considered as important as the kimchi itself. That strategy, it turns out, has a precise scientific explanation. Kimchi produces a range of lactobacillus strains, most notably Lactobacillus kimchi, not commonly found in other fermented foods. Studies document its effects on immune modulation, cholesterol reduction, insulin sensitivity, and inflammatory markers. But here is what most sources omit. The garlic contributes prebiotic fibers that specifically feed the probiotic bacteria being delivered simultaneously. Kimchi does not just deposit beneficial bacteria in your gut, it sends them in with a food supply. The capsaicin adds anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. The ginger contributes compounds with studied effects on circulation and nausea. This is a synergistic food system built through millennia of careful observation, not a collection of ingredients that happen to end up together, multiple varieties at every meal. Researchers now understand that variety maps to greater microbial diversity reaching the gut, and microbiome diversity is one of the most consistent markers of long-term health in the current literature. Genesis chapter 18. Abraham sits at his tent entrance in the heat of the day when 3 visitors appear. He runs to meet them and immediately begins preparing food, butter and milk alongside the calf he has slaughtered. What Abraham served as the finest hospitality he could offer was almost certainly fermented dairy. Fresh milk in the ancient world spoiled within hours. What people drank, what they gave their children, what they set before honored guests, was culture-rich, living, fermented milk. The most potent version of that tradition comes from the Caucasus Mountain region. Kefir, made by culturing milk with kefir grains, symbiotic colonies of bacteria and yeast that look like small cauliflower florets, produces a drink containing between 20 and 60 distinct probiotic strains. Commercial yogurt contains 2 to 7. This is not a marginal difference. It is a categorically different food doing categorically different work. The Caucasus Mountain peoples were among the longest-lived populations ever documented. Researchers noted lifespans routinely past 100 years, with physical and cognitive function well into old age. Kefir was a daily fixture without exception. Modern clinical trials confirm what those communities demonstrated empirically. Kefir colonizes the gut. The strains establish residence and multiply rather than merely passing through. Studies show it reduces lactose intolerance symptoms, improves irritable bowel syndrome, reduces inflammatory markers, and demonstrates anti-tumor activity in animal models, whole unskimmed milk only. The fat-soluble vitamins and conjugated linoleic acid in full-fat dairy contribute in ways low-fat milk cannot replicate. 1 cup daily. Real kefir, thinner, slightly carbonated, sour enough to make you pay attention. That sourness is the living cultures confirming they are present. Proverbs chapter 31 references fermented wine not as moral failing, but as medicine, administered deliberately to those who were suffering. That framing reflects a truth that civilizations across China, Russia, and Eastern Europe independently arrived at over 2,000 years. Fermented beverages were not recreational, they were therapeutic. Kombucha is one of the oldest examples of that principle still available today. Fermented sweet tea transformed over 1 to 3 weeks by a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Kombucha's documented history spans multiple continents for more than 2,000 years. German and Russian researchers brought it into Western medical literature in the early 20th century, investigating its effects on digestion and liver function. The fermentation produces organic acids, primarily acetic acid and glucuronic acid. Glucuronic acid binds to toxins in the liver and facilitates elimination through the kidneys and bile. That is the documented biochemistry beneath the ancient claim that fermented tonics help the body clear what does not belong. The research is still developing, and overstating the evidence would be dishonest. But the mechanisms are real, and findings are consistent across independent studies. Kombucha also produces B vitamins and antioxidant compounds from tea polyphenols. Its probiotic count is lower than kefir or sauerkraut, but its organic acid profile gives it a distinct therapeutic role neither replicates. Raw, unpasteurized kombucha with live cultures and under 5 grams of sugar per serving, 4 to 8 ounces before a meal. Purposeful and measured, exactly the way ancient cultures always used fermented tonics. Here is a distinction that changes everything you think you know about yogurt. The yogurt the ancient world ate, strained, full fat, fermented for 12 to 24 hours until the cultures genuinely proliferated, is a fundamentally different food from the fruit-flavored, low-fat, heat-treated product filling most refrigerators today. They share a name. They do not share a function. And the modern version is not a refinement of the ancient one. It is a replacement of it. Psalm 81 records God offering Israel the finest wheat and honey from the rock. The food culture surrounding that promise, the pastoral economy of ancient Israel, the dairy practices of Mesopotamia and Egypt, was one in which fermented dairy was not a wellness trend. It was daily food, as ordinary as bread. Here is what most people would never guess. Multiple civilizations developed yogurt-style fermented dairy completely independently. Greek, Middle Eastern, South Asian, Central Asian, each arrived at the same basic preparation without any contact with the others. Most people assume that kind of convergence is coincidence. It is not coincidence, it is evidence. When completely separate cultures with no communication, no shared trade routes, no common influence, all arrive at the same food, that is not culture. That is biology confirming something real. Controlled trials on genuine cultured yogurt show it reduces the duration of infectious diarrhea, supports gut recovery after antibiotic use, and reduces antibiotic-associated infection risk. Full-fat fermented dairy contains conjugated linoleic acid with documented anti-inflammatory effects. Stripping the fat removes that compound entirely. Strain it into labano, the way Greeks and Middle Easterners have for centuries. Eat it with olive oil and herbs, not fruit syrup and granola. The food is the medicine. What the modern version adds is largely undoing what the fermentation already did. And that pattern, stripping the thing that actually works and selling you back a hollow version of it, is exactly what happened to every item still to come on this list. Starting with number 10, we still have 10 items to go, and the further down this list we move, the more surprising the science becomes. Number 8 in particular, we are going to stop the countdown entirely for that one, because what happened to a prophet in the wilderness, and what modern physiology now says about it, is not a story you will find anywhere else. Most people who eat miso think of it as a flavoring, a base for soup, something that adds depth to a broth. That is not what it is. In the book of Ezekiel chapter 4, grain preparations and fermented foods are described with a level of culinary specificity unusual for scripture, suggesting they were understood as something closer to medicine than to an ordinary meal. That intersection of fermentation and grain is one of the oldest medical traditions in human history, and miso is its most refined expression. Japan developed miso over 1,000 years ago by fermenting soybeans with rice or barley using a mold called Aspergillus oryzae. The practice never wavered. Daily miso soup at breakfast remains among the most consistent dietary habits in the population, with the longest documented life expectancy on Earth. Most researchers assume that was about diet broadly, about fish, about portion size. It was not only that. The fermentation transforms soybeans through enzymatic breakdown in ways that make the finished product almost unrecognizable from the raw ingredient. Extraordinarily rich in digestive enzymes and free amino acids. It also reduces the phytic acid in soybeans, the compound that otherwise blocks mineral absorption, which explains something that puzzled researchers for decades. Traditional Asian cultures eating soy daily did not develop the mineral deficiencies linked to unfermented soy consumption in Western diets. Fermented soy and unfermented soy are not the same food. They do not do the same things. Studies show miso specifically reduces inflammatory markers, supports beneficial gut bacteria, and may have protective effects on the stomach lining. One preparation detail that traditional Japanese cooks followed for centuries, and that most people in the West ignore entirely. Dissolve miso into hot but not boiling liquid. Boiling destroys the enzymatic activity that makes it therapeutically distinct. That instruction appears in Japanese culinary texts going back hundreds of years. They followed it before anyone understood the biochemistry. The biochemistry now explains why they were right. Look for long-aged darker miso, fermented for 2 to 3 years rather than weeks. The bioactive compound concentration increases dramatically with fermentation time. The pale, quick versions in most Western supermarkets are a shadow of what this food actually is. When King David was fleeing Jerusalem, running for his life from his own son Absalom, people came to meet his exhausted army with provisions. Most people picture bread, grain, perhaps dried fruit. The list included cheese, almost certainly a hard-aged variety that could survive days of travel without refrigeration, and deliver concentrated nutrition to men who needed to keep moving through a crisis. Hard-aged cheese in the ancient world was not a luxury. It was exactly what you brought to feed a desperate army on the move, and what those men carried was alive in ways that almost nothing in the modern dairy aisle is. Aged raw milk cheeses, traditional Parmesan, raw milk cheddar, aged Gouda, Roquefort, Manchego, contain active bacterial cultures that survive within the cheese matrix and reach the gut intact. Decades of industrial pasteurization have obscured this almost entirely from public awareness. Studies show they contain lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, and other beneficial species in meaningful counts. The aging process also produces short-chain fatty acids that directly feed colonocytes, the cells lining your colon, supporting intestinal integrity in ways other fermented foods cannot replicate through the same mechanism. Here is the detail most sources omit entirely. Aged raw cheese is one of the richest dietary sources of vitamin K2 in the most bioavailable form. K2 directs calcium away from arterial walls and into bones where it belongs. Its deficiency has been implicated in arterial calcification, osteoporosis, and cardiovascular disease simultaneously. 1 to 2 ounces with a meal, a condiment, not a centerpiece. Small dose, real impact. 1 Kings chapter 19. The prophet Elijah has been running for his life. He has fled into the wilderness of the Negev, gone a full day's journey beyond the last settlement, and collapsed under a broom tree at the edge of exhaustion. He asks to die. The text records that he lay down and fell asleep, the sleep of a body that has nothing left. An angel appears and touches him. Arise and eat. Elijah looks up, and there beside his head is a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. He eats, drinks, and lies down again. The angel comes a second time. Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. He eats again. And then the text records something that stops making sense if you read it the way most people do. He arose and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, on bread and water, 40 days. Most people read that and file it under miracle, under the supernatural provision of God, and the faith dimension is real. But there is something else happening in that verse that nobody talks about. Sit with it for a moment. A body depleted of glycogen, electrolytes, and every energy substrate it depends on, given 2 things, complex fermented grain carbohydrates and water, and restored to a state capable of sustaining 40 days of travel through wilderness terrain. That is not a vague biblical metaphor. That is a precise description of cellular restoration. And the bread that made it possible was not the bread sitting in a plastic bag on your kitchen counter. Real sourdough. Not the bakery versions made with commercial yeast, not the loaves produced in 2 hours. Is bread leavened exclusively by wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, fermented for a minimum of 8 to 12 hours and often 24 to 48. During that long fermentation, something happens that commercial bread production has entirely bypassed. The lactobacillus bacteria consume the sugars that would otherwise spike blood glucose. They produce acids that break down phytic acid, the compound in wheat that blocks absorption of zinc, iron, and magnesium. They partially digest the gluten proteins, making them structurally different and significantly more manageable for the digestive system. The bread begins digesting itself before it ever reaches your mouth. Studies comparing genuine long-fermented sourdough to conventional bread show meaningfully lower glycemic responses, better mineral absorption, and improved digestibility, even in people who normally react to wheat. Some individuals with non-celiac gluten sensitivity tolerate long-fermented sourdough without the symptoms triggered by standard bread. Researchers describe those findings as promising and worth continued investigation. The bread Elijah ate was almost certainly something close to this. Dense, whole grain, slow-made, kept alive by the microbes naturally present in the grain itself, and it sustained a man through something that should have been physiologically impossible. Make it at home. Whole grain flour, a maintained sourdough starter, and 12 to 24 hours minimum, no shortcuts. The fermentation is the medicine. The industrial loaf in a plastic bag with a 3-week shelf life is not bread in any ancestral sense. It shares a shape with bread. That is approximately where the resemblance ends. You have almost certainly never heard of this one, and that gap between how obscure it is in the modern world and how seriously the ancient world took it is itself the most interesting thing about it. What entered the body, and in what quantities, was treated with profound seriousness throughout Hebrew scripture. Ezekiel was instructed to drink measured water alongside his prescribed bread during his period of symbolic prophecy. The medicinal role of specific fermented beverages spans virtually every ancient culture. Kvass is one of the most potent examples the Western world has almost entirely forgotten. A traditional Eastern European fermented beverage used medicinally across Russia, Ukraine, and Poland for centuries. Bread kvass is produced by fermenting rye bread crusts in water. But beet kvass is what the medical literature finds more interesting. Raw beets fermented in salted water, used across Eastern European folk medicine for liver conditions, sluggish digestion, and anemia, concentrates the beet's betalain content while enhancing the bioavailability of dietary nitrates. Here is what that actually means inside the body. The nitrates convert into nitric oxide, the molecule that dilates blood vessels, improves circulation, and reduces blood pressure. Randomized controlled trials show genuine reductions in systolic blood pressure of 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury, a magnitude researchers compare to certain pharmaceutical interventions through a completely different mechanism and without the side effects. The lacto-fermentation also increases the bioavailability of iron and folate within the beet, making beet kvass particularly useful for iron deficiency, a condition the Eastern European herbalists who relied on it had identified empirically long before iron metabolism was scientifically understood. 4 ounces before meals. Most people who stay with it for 2 weeks stop noticing the taste and start noticing what shifts in how they feel. Here is something that should make you stop and think. Capsaicin-rich preparations appear in Aztec medicine, Ayurvedic practice, and traditional West African herbalism. 3 civilizations, separated by oceans, no contact with each other, all arriving at the same conclusion, that fermenting hot peppers and consuming them daily did something specific and important to the body. Most people assume that is coincidence, that cultures just happen to like spicy food. That is not what is happening. That kind of convergence across completely separate civilizations is not culture. It is biology confirming something real, the same way independent yogurt development across 4 continents was not coincidence. It was evidence. Fermented hot sauce, made by lacto-fermenting fresh hot peppers with salt over 3 to 7 days, is meaningfully different from the commercial version made with distilled vinegar. The fermentation produces live lactobacillus cultures while simultaneously concentrating the capsaicin. Capsaicin binds to specific receptors in the gut lining and triggers a cascade of documented effects. Thermogenesis. Studies show it elevates metabolic rate for several hours after consumption, a result replicated across multiple clinical trials. Stimulation of digestive enzyme secretion. Appetite modulation through effects on hunger signaling hormones, and direct antimicrobial activity against Helicobacter pylori, one of the most common drivers of gastric ulcers, a finding with significant practical implications for anyone who has ever dealt with persistent stomach discomfort. Recent research has also identified an interaction between capsaicin and butyrate-producing bacteria in the gut. Butyrate is among the most studied protective compounds in gut health research, linked to colon cancer prevention, intestinal barrier integrity, and systemic anti-inflammatory effects. A tablespoon or 2 on food at every meal. Traditional Mexican, Korean, and West African cuisines all feature fermented pepper preparations as daily staples. not accidents of flavor. Functional foods built into cultural habit over generations of careful observation. The science is now explaining what those generations already knew. There is a line in the book of Sauerkraut, recognized as scripture by Catholic and Orthodox traditions, that most people have read past without stopping. The Lord has created medicines out of the earth, and the wise will not reject them. Honey and garlic appear separately throughout ancient medical and sacred texts with a frequency that suggests their value was never theoretical. They were used daily by people who needed them to work. But here is what almost nobody knows. What happens when you ferment them together is categorically different from what either ingredient does on its own. Most people assume combining garlic and honey is just a folk remedy, something grandmothers recommended without any real mechanism behind it. That assumption is wrong. Raw honey creates an environment that transforms garlic over 4 to 8 weeks in ways that neither ingredient achieves alone. The enzymatic environment of raw honey, its hydrogen peroxide producing compounds, its low water activity, its antimicrobial peptide content, stabilizes and concentrates the active compounds in garlic. Allicin, the primary therapeutic compound in garlic, becomes more bioavailable through this process. The naturally occurring microbiota present on both ingredients initiate a slow fermentation that produces additional bioactive compounds not present in either ingredient separately. Clinical research on garlic shows it reduces the frequency of colds and upper respiratory infections, lowers blood pressure, reduces LDL cholesterol, and demonstrates broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity against pathogens, including some antibiotic-resistant strains. Research on raw honey confirms antibacterial effects, antiviral properties, and wound healing acceleration. Together, fermented, they produce something that functions as household medicine in the most literal sense of that word. The preparation detail most people get wrong. The garlic must be raw and freshly peeled, not pre-minced, not jarred. The honey must be raw and unfiltered, still containing live enzymes and pollen. Pasteurized honey will not ferment the same way. Submerge whole, peeled cloves in raw honey in a clean jar. Leave at room temperature for 4 to 8 weeks, opening the lid briefly every few days to release pressure. The cloves will darken, soften, and eventually become almost sweet, the sharpness of raw garlic mellowed by weeks of enzymatic transformation. 1 to 3 cloves daily during cold and flu season, more at the first sign of illness. This is the kind of preparation that existed in every traditional household before medicine came in blister packs. Most people assume vinegar is just a condiment, something you put on salad, something that makes food taste sharp. That is not how the ancient world understood it. Vinegar appears in scripture in 2 places that most casual readers move past entirely. In Ruth chapter 2, Boaz invites Ruth to eat bread and dip her morsel in vinegar, not as a flavoring, but as an act of hospitality, vinegar as ordinary table presence. In Numbers chapter 6, the Nazirite vow specifically prohibits wine vinegar, which implies that fermented vinegar was common enough to require explicit prohibition in a vow of separation from ordinary life. Vinegar was not exotic in the biblical world. It was daily food, daily medicine, as present on the ancient table as salt. Real apple cider vinegar with the mother is the product of a double fermentation. Apples ferment first into hard cider. A second fermentation converts the alcohol into acetic acid. The mother, the living colony of bacteria responsible for that second transformation, remains visible as a cloudy mass at the bottom of unfiltered, unpasteurized bottles. That cloudiness is what most commercial production filters away in the name of visual clarity. Along with it goes the therapeutic dimension. Multiple controlled clinical trials have shown that consuming 1 to 2 tablespoons before a high carbohydrate meal reduces the post-meal blood glucose spike by 15 to 30%. The mechanism is documented. Acetic acid inhibits the enzyme that breaks starch into glucose, slowing carbohydrate absorption in a way that meaningfully changes the body's insulin response. For anyone managing blood sugar, and given the current metabolic health landscape that is most people, that finding is clinically significant. Here is the mechanism that almost never gets discussed. Apple cider vinegar stimulates gastric acid production in people with low stomach acid, a condition researchers estimate affects a significant and profoundly underdiagnosed percentage of adults. Low stomach acid drives chronic bloating, inadequate protein digestion, mineral malabsorption, and pathogen susceptibility. 1 tablespoon of diluted apple cider vinegar before meals can resolve symptoms that years of antacids only deepen. 1 tablespoon in 8 ounces of water, 15 minutes before meals. Never undiluted. The acidity damages tooth enamel and the esophageal lining over time. Diluted, it is among the most evidence-supported and inexpensive interventions on this entire list. Most people in the Western world have never heard of this one, and the gap between how obscure it is here and how seriously traditional Japanese culture has taken it for over 1,000 years is worth paying attention to. Proverbs chapter 17 says that a cheerful heart is good medicine. The ancient world understood medicine not as something dispensed from a pharmacy, but as something built into daily food and daily habit. Nowhere is that principle more dramatically confirmed by modern science than in natto. Natto is fermented soybeans made with Bacillus subtilis, and it produces something found nowhere else in the food supply, a compound called nattokinase. Most people who hear that assume it is just another probiotic, just another fermented food with general gut benefits. It is not. Nattokinase has been shown in clinical trials to dissolve fibrin, the protein that forms blood clots. With a mechanism researchers have compared favorably to pharmaceutical thrombolytics in terms of cardiovascular protection. It directly reduces thrombosis risk, lowers blood viscosity, and acts through a pathway distinct from common anticoagulant medications, with a safety profile researchers describe as significantly different from pharmaceutical alternatives. For anyone concerned about cardiovascular health, these findings are among the most clinically significant in all of fermented food research. Here is the detail most sources omit. Nattokinase activity is heat sensitive. Commercial nattokinase supplements are processed at temperatures that significantly reduce enzymatic activity. The only way to guarantee biologically active nattokinase is through the food itself, eaten at or below body temperature. Do not heat natto. Eat it cold or at room temperature, traditionally over warm rice, where the heat of the rice does not directly contact the natto itself. Natto is also the single richest dietary source of vitamin K2 in the MK7 form. A single serving provides over 300 micrograms compared to the 30 to 50 micrograms most researchers recommend daily. K2 directs calcium out of arteries and into bones simultaneously. Its deficiency has been implicated in arterial calcification and osteoporosis at the same time. Natto addresses both in one food. The flavor and texture are genuinely challenging on first encounter, stringy, pungent, assertively fermented. Traditional Japanese breakfast culture treats it as completely unremarkable, which is its own form of evidence about what sustained daily use looks like. 50 to 100 grams over rice several times per week. Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 31. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Whatever the spiritual dimension of that promise, and it is profound, there is a physiological reality underneath it that fermented beetroot addresses in a remarkably direct way. And the confirmation of that came from a source nobody expected. Elite sports regulatory bodies. Some of the most rigorous anti-doping organizations in professional athletics now restrict beetroot preparations because the performance enhancement is measurable enough to create an unfair advantage. That is an unusual form of confirmation about the potency of a vegetable. Not a supplement, not a pharmaceutical, a fermented root vegetable that Eastern European grandmothers have been putting in jars for centuries. The nitrates in beets, concentrated further through lacto-fermentation, are converted by oral bacteria into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide dilates blood vessels, improves oxygen delivery to working muscles, and enhances cardiovascular endurance. Randomized controlled trials show genuine improvements in time to physical exhaustion, better oxygen efficiency, and faster recovery. Here is the preparation detail most sources get wrong. Raw fermented beets retain dramatically higher levels of active betalanes and bioavailable nitrates than cooked beets. Heat degrades both compounds significantly. The traditional Eastern European preparation, raw beets, filtered water, a small amount of non-iodized salt, 3 to 5 days at room temperature, is not only the simplest method, but the medically superior one. No cooking, no boiling. The brine that results is the most concentrated form of the food's active compounds. 3 to 4 ounces of that brine daily before physical activity, or as a morning tonic. The fermentation also increases the bioavailability of iron and folate within the beet, making fermented beetroot particularly useful for anyone dealing with iron deficiency fatigue. The color will alarm you. Deep pink red in urine and occasionally stool. That is the betalains being processed. That is not a problem. That is the food working. Most people have had something in their kitchen at some point that fits this category. A jar of pickles from a farmer's market. Something a grandmother made that sat in the back of the refrigerator and smelled sharp and sour and alive. They used it as a condiment or ignored it or threw it away when they moved. And they had no idea what they were discarding. The lacto-fermented vegetable, cucumber, carrot, radish, turnip, green bean, cauliflower, any vegetable preserved in salted brine through natural fermentation, is perhaps the most ancient prepared food in human history. It appears under different names, with different vegetables, different spices, across virtually every culture that ever existed. The same fundamental mechanism every time: salt, water, time, and the intelligence of the microbial world doing what it has always done when given the right conditions. Here is the distinction that determines whether any of this actually reaches your body. And most people get this wrong. Was vinegar added, or did the acidity develop through live fermentation? Almost every pickle in a standard grocery store aisle uses distilled white vinegar. It is not a fermented food. It is an acidified food. No bacteria were involved. No bacteria survived. It is shelf-stable, predictable, and therapeutically inert. It shares a name with real fermented pickles. That is the extent of the resemblance. Real lacto-fermented pickles are made with cucumbers, filtered water, and non-iodized salt. The salt creates conditions where lactobacillus bacteria, naturally present on the cucumber skin, thrive, produce lactic acid, and preserve the vegetable through genuine biological transformation. These pickles live in the refrigerator because they are alive. Studies show they increase the density and diversity of beneficial gut bacteria, contain meaningful amounts of vitamin C and B vitamins produced during fermentation, and deliver organic acids that shift the gut environment in favor of beneficial bacteria. The brine is medicinally active and should never be discarded. Athletes have used pickle brine for rapid muscle cramp relief, a phenomenon researchers have now linked to a neural reflex triggered by the acidic compounds rather than simple hydration. You can make these at home with a mason jar, vegetables, salt, and water. The investment is almost nothing. The return in terms of what your gut receives is significant. Check the label on any jar in your refrigerator right now. If the first acidic ingredient listed is vinegar, it is not what your body is asking for. If the only acid present is lactic acid produced by the bacteria themselves, that is the real thing. That is what your grandmother kept in the back of her refrigerator. That is what civilizations built their gut health on for thousands of years before anyone had a word for microbiome. And it has been sitting in your kitchen the whole time. There is one principle running through every item on this list, and it is the most important thing we can leave you with. Quality is not a preference. Quality is the medicine. The active compounds in every food we covered today are fragile in ways that industrial processing does not respect and was never designed to respect. Pasteurization was designed to create shelf stability. It does that perfectly. It also eliminates every living thing the food ever contained. The difference between raw, unpasteurized sauerkraut and the shelf-stable canned version is not a small nutritional gap. One contains billions of live organisms doing complex biological work in your gut. The other shares a name with it. That is the entire extent of their resemblance. The people who built these traditions had no laboratories. They had bodies. Bodies that told them what worked and what did not. The German sailors packing barrels of sauerkraut. The Korean households maintaining dozens of kimchi varieties through every season. The Japanese families dissolving miso into warm broth every single morning for 1,000 years. The Eastern European grandmothers pressing beets into salted water and waiting. They were not following a wellness trend. They were following something older and more reliable than any trend has ever been. Scripture understood this long before food science existed. The Lord has created medicines out of the earth, not in a laboratory, not behind a pharmacy counter, out of the earth, growing, fermenting, alive, available to anyone with a mason jar, a handful of salt, and the patience to let time do what time has always done. Drop a comment and tell us which item surprised you most. Subscribe and hit the bell. We are here every week. The culture is already alive. All you have to do is let it work.